It didn't begin with a headline, it began with silence, the kind that settles heavily over palace corridors when something has gone terribly wrong. When Princess Anne emerged from a closed-door council session, aides avoided eye contact and conversations stopped mid-sentence. Within hours, whispers spread of something far more dangerous than scandal. Documents had vanished. And not just any documents, royal correspondence tied to the crown's deepest legacy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Behind those sealed doors, the atmosphere had reportedly turned suffocating long before Anne stepped out into the corridor. Senior aides, legal advisors, and a handful of the crown's most trusted custodians of history had been summoned without warning, their urgency cutting through the usual ceremonial calm like a blade. No official agenda had been shared. No minutes were to be recorded. What unfolded inside was not routine governance, it was containment. Because somewhere within the vast, heavily guarded royal archives, something had slipped through the cracks, and the realization came not with clarity, but with dread. The missing correspondence wasn't recent, nor was it trivial. These were letters bound to historic estates, documents believed to trace decisions, promises, and perhaps even quiet disputes that had shaped the crown's authority over generations. Their absence didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised alarms deep within the monarchy's inner sanctum. Staff were immediately instructed to maintain absolute silence, a command so rare and forceful that even seasoned insiders felt its weight. Conversations that might have once lingered in private corners were now extinguished before they could begin. Something had changed and everyone knew it. Anne, known for her composure under pressure, became the clearest signal that this was no ordinary issue. Those who saw her leave the meeting described a tension that couldn't be concealed, a tightness in her expression that spoke louder than any statement the palace would refuse to give. It wasn't panic, but it was close. The kind of controlled urgency that only emerges when the stakes are far higher than public perception can grasp. And within hours, the internal machinery of the monarchy shifted gears, quietly initiating protocols meant for breaches that were never supposed to happen. Because this wasn't just about lost paperwork, it was about a fracture in trust. The royal archival system, long regarded as impenetrable, had been compromised, or worse, manipulated. And as whispers began to escape beyond palace walls, media insiders started connecting the dots, describing it not as a sudden scandal, but as something far more dangerous, a slow-burning crisis that had been simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. But the missing letters weren't just misplaced, they were tied to a legacy battle decades in the making. Long before this crisis, the letters were never meant to be seen inked in an era when the monarchy guarded its secrets like sacred scripture. Yet now, those same documents have become the center of a modern royal reckoning. They trace back to the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, a time when every written word carried not just authority, but consequence. When decisions were often recorded in private ink rather than public decree, these were not ceremonial notes or routine exchanges, they were instruments of quiet power, drafted in moments where the future of estates, titles, and influence hung in delicate balance. Within those pages, references emerged subtle yet unmistakable to places like Balmoral Castle and Sandringham Estate, not merely as residences, but as symbols of continuity, inheritance, and deeply personal authority. These estates were more than land, they were anchors of legacy, each tied to decisions that blurred the line between private ownership and sovereign identity. And within that blurred line, the letters found their true purpose. They became what insiders would later describe as a sacred trust, a term not used lightly, but with the full weight of a monarchy determined to protect its inner workings from the shifting winds of public scrutiny. But what made them sacred was also what made them dangerous, because speculation, once ignited, refused to settle. Some believed the correspondence contained inheritance directives that deviated from the expected line, quiet instructions that could reshape the distribution of royal assets in ways never publicly acknowledged. Others whispered of authority lines, private clarifications of power that existed parallel to constitutional frameworks, invisible yet potent. And then there were the more unsettling theories, the ones that spoke of personal decrees, decisions made in confidence that, if revealed, might challenge not just reputations, but the very perception of stability within the crown. For decades, these documents remained sealed, not out of tradition alone, but necessity. Their protection was deliberate, enforced through layers of protocol designed to ensure that only a select few could even confirm their existence. Access was restricted, records were obscured, and any mention of their contents was carefully avoided, as though even acknowledging them risked unraveling something far greater. The monarchy had long understood that its strength did not lie solely in what was known, but in what remained hidden. And yet, as the present crisis began to unfold, a new and more unsettling possibility took hold. This was not a simple case of loss or misplacement. The precision of the disappearance, the silence that followed, the urgency behind closed doors, it all pointed toward intention. Someone, at some point, may have sought not just to find these letters, but to access them for a purpose that remained deliberately concealed. And if that were true, then this was no longer about preservation, it was about interference. Because once the idea took root that these documents could be altered, interpreted, or even weaponized, the stakes shifted dramatically. The letters were no longer relics of the past, they became active pieces in a present-day struggle, their contents holding the potential to redefine alliances, challenge assumptions, and ignite conflicts that had been dormant for decades. And as that realization settled in, one question began to echo louder than the rest, impossible to ignore and far too dangerous to leave unanswered. And if those documents held power, the question became unavoidable: who stood to gain from their disappearance? Security at the palace is designed to be impenetrable, which is why the idea that someone got close enough to remove royal correspondence has sent shockwaves through even the most hardened insiders. For generations, the system had been trusted not just for its strength, but for its certainty, a closed loop where every movement was accounted for, every entry recorded, every document preserved with near-religious discipline. And yet, as the realization began to settle in the aftermath of those missing letters, one truth emerged with chilling clarity. This did not feel like an attack from the outside. It felt like something far more calculated, far more intimate. Early reports didn't speak in absolutes, but they didn't need to. The language was careful, almost hesitant, yet the implications were impossible to ignore. An internal breach, those two words carried a weight that rippled quietly through the institution. Because if the fortress had not been broken into, then it had been opened. And that meant someone within had either the access, the authority, or the audacity to cross a line that was never meant to be crossed. It wasn't chaos that alarmed them, it was precision. Access logs, long considered the backbone of archival security, reportedly began telling a story no one wanted to hear. Small inconsistencies at first, a timestamp that didn't align, a record that seemed to exist without context. Individually, they might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely, but once seen, it changed everything. Because the archives didn't forget. They didn't make mistakes. And if the records were faltering, then something or someone had interfered. Whispers began to circulate, not in public forums, but in the quiet, controlled conversations of those who understood what was at stake. Unusual movements within royal offices. Individuals present in corridors where they had no scheduled reason to be. Routine behaviors that, in hindsight, felt just slightly out of place. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, but enough to create unease. Enough to make even the most loyal insiders question whether what they were witnessing was coincidence or something far more deliberate. Then came the timeline, and with it, a tightening sense of inevitability. The documents had last been verified during a routine audit, checked, sealed, and confirmed. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. And then, within a window that now seemed far too narrow, they were gone. No forced access, no alarm triggered, just absence. Clean, quiet, and deeply unsettling. The kind of disappearance that doesn't happen by accident, but by design. As suspicion began to spread, it did so carefully, almost cautiously, as though the institution itself feared what might happen if it moved too quickly or accused too soon. Names were not spoken openly, but the circle of possibility began to narrow. Attention turned inward, toward those with proximity, with knowledge, with something to lose or perhaps something to gain. And as that tension grew, so did the realization that this was no longer a question of how it happened, but why. Because access alone wasn't enough to explain the risk. Whoever had done this hadn't just taken documents, they had taken something protected, something dangerous, something that had remained hidden for a reason. And that shifted the entire narrative from breach to motive, from possibility to intent. But this wasn't just about access, it was about intent, and what someone hoped to rewrite. Where others hesitated, Princess Anne acted. Known within the institution as the Crown's most unyielding enforcer, she did not wait for clarity to emerge, she imposed it. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, while uncertainty still hung thick and unanswered questions threatened to spiral into speculation, Anne moved with a precision that left little room for doubt. This was no longer a passive crisis to be observed. It was a situation to be contained, dissected, and controlled before it could fracture something far deeper within the monarchy's foundation. The response she initiated was swift and uncompromising, described by insiders as nothing short of a full audit protocol. But this was no ordinary review. It was an exhaustive sweep of every layer connected to the royal archives, every record, every access point, every individual with even the slightest proximity to the missing correspondence. Legal teams were pulled in without delay, their role not just advisory but defensive, preparing for implications that had yet to surface but were already feared. Archivists, long trusted as silent guardians of history, were suddenly thrust into the center of a storm, their expertise now critical to tracing movements that had left almost no visible trace. Simultaneously, restrictions tightened across royal properties with a force that disrupted long-standing routines. Access once granted through tradition or seniority was abruptly reconsidered, scrutinized, and in many cases revoked. Doors that had always opened now remained closed. Systems that had quietly operated in the background were elevated to the forefront, monitored with an intensity that signaled just how serious the breach had become. It was not simply about preventing further loss, it was about reasserting control over a structure that had, even if briefly, shown vulnerability. But Anne did not act alone. Coordination extended to Prince William, whose involvement marked a broader institutional response rather than an isolated effort. This was no longer confined to a single office or department, it was a unified front. A recognition that whatever had been taken or tampered with carried implications that could echo across generations. Together, they began shaping what insiders would later describe as a doctrine-like strategy, an approach that went beyond immediate recovery and into long-term protection. It was given a name spoken quietly but with unmistakable weight: the Archive Protocol. The protocol itself was not publicly defined, but its presence was felt. It represented a shift in how the monarchy would confront threats not from the outside, but from within. Every action under its scope carried urgency, a sense that time was not on their side, because this was not just about documents, it was about continuity, about preserving a lineage of authority that depended as much on what remained hidden as what was known. And if those foundations were questioned, even slightly, the consequences could extend far beyond the walls of any archive. As the investigation deepened, the tone grew sharper, more intense, reflecting a reality that few dared to articulate openly. The risk was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, it was evolving. And with every new detail uncovered, the sense of containment began to give way to something more volatile. And as the investigation tightened, its consequences began to ripple far beyond the archive rooms. The palace doesn't erupt, it freezes. And in that stillness, consequences are delivered quietly, decisively, and without appeal. The shift was immediate, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but inside the institution, it was unmistakable. Roles began to change without announcement. Staff who once moved freely found their access quietly suspended. Others were reassigned under the language of operational necessity, a phrase that concealed far more than it revealed. There were no public accusations, no dramatic confrontations, only a slow, methodical tightening of control that signaled something far more serious than routine discipline. Conversations turned cautious, then selective, then absent altogether. Those who found themselves even loosely connected to the areas under scrutiny experienced a kind of social and institutional distancing that was both subtle and absolute. Invitations faded. Responsibilities shifted. Presence alone became a liability. It wasn't punishment in the traditional sense, it was isolation, the kind designed to protect the structure while quietly testing loyalty. Because in a crisis like this, proximity to suspicion was enough to redraw boundaries that had once seemed permanent. And within that silence, something more dangerous began to take shape. not chaos but division. Small at first, almost invisible, yet steadily growing. Factions, loosely defined but deeply felt, began forming within the royal household. Lines were not openly declared, but they were understood. Some aligned themselves with the urgency of containment, backing the aggressive measures unfolding under Princess Anne's direction. Others, more cautious, questioned whether the response risked destabilizing the very institution it sought to protect. Trust, once assumed, now required careful consideration. And as those internal currents shifted, unity long considered the monarchy's greatest shield began to feel less certain. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, navigating a position that demanded both authority and restraint. He was not removed from the crisis, nor fully immersed in its execution. Instead, he found himself balancing two competing imperatives: the need to mediate growing tensions within his own household and the responsibility to preserve order at any cost. Every decision carried weight, not just in its immediate impact, but in what it signaled about leadership, about control, about the future direction of the crown. And in moments like these, even silence could be interpreted as strategy or hesitation. Outside the palace, the pressure was building in ways that could no longer be contained. Media speculation intensified, fueled by fragments of information that hinted at something far larger than a simple internal issue. Words like breach, conflict, and concealment began to circulate with increasing frequency, each one adding another layer of scrutiny. The monarchy, so carefully maintained in its public image, now faced a subtle but undeniable strain. Not a collapse, but a shift, a questioning. A sense that something fundamental had been disturbed, even if the full truth remained just out of reach. And as the external noise grew louder, it began to intersect with the internal silence, creating a tension that could not hold indefinitely. Because beneath the controlled responses, the measured actions, and the carefully managed appearances, there was an undercurrent that refused to settle a realization that this crisis was not just exposing vulnerabilities, but perhaps something far more unsettling. Yet beneath the surface-level fallout, a deeper truth was beginning to emerge. In royal history, nothing disappears without reason. And when motives begin to surface, they often reveal more than the act itself. The missing correspondence was no longer viewed as an isolated breach, but as a calculated move within a much larger and far more intricate struggle. Because within the monarchy, actions are rarely impulsive. They are deliberate, layered, and often rooted in tensions that have existed long before any single incident brings them to light. And as quiet theories began to take shape behind closed doors, one possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. These documents were not taken at random, they were chosen. The question of why quickly turned into a web of competing interpretations. Some pointed toward inheritance, suggesting that the letters may have contained directives capable of influencing how estates, wealth, and authority were distributed across generations. Others leaned toward titles' subtle clarifications or private intentions that could shift the balance of recognition within the royal hierarchy. And then there were those who focused on influence itself, arguing that control over estates like Balmoral Castle or Sandringham Estate extended far beyond land ownership, shaping not only legacy but perception, power, and permanence. But beneath these surface-level explanations, a deeper current began to emerge, one that spoke less about individual gain and more about legacy control. The monarchy, by its very nature, is built on continuity, on the careful preservation of authority across time. And within that structure, the past is never truly gone, it remains active, influential, and at times, contested. The missing letters, tied so closely to decisions made during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, may have represented more than historical records. They may have held the power to affirm or challenge the very foundations upon which current authority rests. Whispers of long-standing internal tensions began to resurface, not as accusations, but as context. Old disagreements, once managed through discretion and silence, now seemed to cast longer shadows. Different interpretations of duty, of entitlement, of what the monarchy should be versus what it had become, these were not new conflicts, but they had rarely been forced into the open. And now, with the disappearance of documents capable of influencing those narratives, the possibility that someone sought to reshape the story itself became impossible to dismiss. Timing, too, played its role. The crown was navigating a period of transition, with King Charles III establishing his reign under the weight of both expectation and scrutiny. Transitions, by their nature, create moments of vulnerability, brief windows where structures are tested, where loyalties are re-examined, where the future feels less certain than the past. And in such moments, even a single disruption can carry consequences far beyond its immediate impact. This incident, then, was not just about missing correspondence. It was a reflection of something broader, something more unsettling. A glimpse into the pressures building beneath the surface of an Arabic caliph, Arabic lamb, Arabic meme, Arabic Hamza Lawal, Arabic scene, Arabic Temur Buddha, built on stability, now facing questions it could not easily answer. Because if the past could be accessed, altered, or withheld, then the narrative of the monarchy itself was no longer fixed, it was fluid, contested, and potentially fragile. And as that realization took hold, the crisis began to shift once more, evolving from an internal breach into something far more consequential, far more revealing, and far more difficult to contain. What began as a disappearance was now something far more dangerous, a test of the monarchy's resilience. The monarchy does not respond with chaos, it responds with order. And when that order is challenged, it is reasserted with precision. In the wake of uncertainty, the institution moved not with visible urgency, but with calculated intent, tightening its grip on every mechanism that defined its stability. Protocols that had once operated quietly in the background were brought forward with renewed force, reinforced and expanded to eliminate even the smallest margin for vulnerability. Document security, already considered sacred, was elevated to an uncompromising standard, layers added, access refined, oversight intensified. What had been shaken was not allowed to fracture. It was reinforced. At the same time, the public face of the crown remained measured, almost immovable. Messaging was carefully controlled, each statement crafted not to reveal, but to reassure. There were no acknowledgments of panic, no hints of internal strain, only a steady projection of continuity. Because perception, within the monarchy, is not secondary to reality, it is part of its foundation. And in moments like these, maintaining that perception became as critical as resolving the crisis itself. The silence was not absence, it was strategy. Behind closed doors, however, coordination intensified among senior figures, including King Charles III, Princess Anne, and Prince William. What had begun as a response to a breach evolved into something far more comprehensive, a unified effort to stabilize not just the archives, but the institution as a whole. Discussions were no longer limited to recovery. They focused on resilience, on ensuring that whatever had been exposed could never again threaten the monarchy's internal equilibrium. It was not reaction, it was recalibration. Authority, too, was subtly but unmistakably reasserted. Decisions were made with clarity, communicated with finality, leaving little room for ambiguity or dissent. The message, though rarely spoken aloud, was understood across every level of the household. The crown remained in control. Roles were clarified, boundaries redrawn, and expectations reinforced. What may have briefly appeared uncertain was now firmly defined again, not through spectacle, but through structure. At the heart of this response was a return to the principles that had sustained the monarchy through centuries of upheaval, tradition, continuity, and control. These were not abstract ideals, they were active tools, guiding every action, every decision, every carefully measured step forward. Because in the end, the monarchy does not survive by avoiding crisis, it survives by absorbing it, reshaping it, and emerging with its authority intact. And that is precisely what began to take form as the immediate tension gave way to a more controlled, deliberate phase of resolution. The signals, though subtle, became increasingly clear. Stability had not been lost, it had been tested. And in that test, the institution had responded not with weakness, but with discipline. The archives were secured, the structure reinforced, the narrative contained. Yet beneath that restored order, the memory of what had occurred lingered, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how close the balance had come to shifting. And in the end, the resolution wasn't just about recovery, it was about reaffirmation. When the noise fades, what remains is silence, the kind that tells you everything has changed, even if nothing is said aloud. In the aftermath of urgency, speculation, and carefully controlled responses, the palace did what it has always done best. It closed ranks. There were no sweeping declarations, no defining moment of public clarity that tied every thread together. Instead, the outcome of the investigation settled into something far more elusive, deliberately opaque, resistant to scrutiny, and impossible to fully decode from the outside. What was resolved remained known only to those within the tightest inner circle, leaving the world to interpret absence as its own kind of answer. The missing correspondence, whether recovered, replaced, or simply contained, was never formally accounted for in a way that satisfied public curiosity, and perhaps that was the point. Because within the monarchy, resolution is not always about disclosure, it is about control. Whatever had been disrupted was brought back into alignment, not through explanation, but through quiet restoration. The system recalibrated itself, sealing any fractures before they could widen, ensuring that the integrity of the archives and the narratives they protected remained intact, even if the path to that outcome was never revealed. Yet something had shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The monarchy that emerged from this moment carried itself with a heightened sense of caution, as though the incident had served as a reminder of vulnerabilities long believed to be theoretical. Access became more deliberate, trust more measured. The openness that occasionally surfaced in quieter times was replaced with a renewed emphasis on discretion. It was not fear that defined this transformation, but awareness, the understanding that even the most enduring institutions are not immune to pressure from within. At the heart of this evolution was a return to principle, a reaffirmation that duty must always stand above personal interest. Whatever motives had driven the disappearance, whatever tensions had surfaced beneath the surface, the response made one thing clear. The Crown would not allow individual ambition or hidden agendas to disrupt its continuity. The institution had absorbed the shock, reasserted its structure, and in doing so, reinforced the idea that its strength lies not in flexibility, but in discipline. And yet, for all the control that was restored, the legacy of the incident did not disappear. It lingered quietly, persistently beneath the surface of every decision, every protocol, every carefully measured interaction. It became part of the monarchy's internal memory, a moment that would not be spoken of openly, but would never be entirely forgotten. Because events like this do not simply pass, they embed themselves into the fabric of the institution, shaping how it thinks, how it acts, how it protects itself moving forward. In the end, the Crown stood as it always had, enduring, composed, and outwardly unshaken. The narrative remained intact, the structure preserved, the authority unquestioned. But beneath that steady exterior was a deeper truth, one understood only by those who had witnessed how close the balance had come to shifting. And it is within that quiet understanding that the monarchy's true nature reveals itself, not in what it shows, but in what it chooses to keep hidden. Because in the end, the monarchy's greatest strength has never been what it reveals, but what it protects in silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.